the 22nd of February, 1943. For 10 long years, the Nazi regime had gripped Germany like a steel vice, squeezing out every breath of freedom. That winter morning in Munich, the air inside the courthouse was colder than the streets outside. It was not just the chill, it was the weight of dread, the sense that this was not a place for justice, but a stage for terror. The spectators leaned forward, their eyes locked on the young defendants, university students, members of the White Rose resistance. Their crime? Handing out leaflets that dared to speak the truth about Hitler's war, leaflets that whispered of freedom in a nation suffocating under dictatorship. There would be no fair trial today. This was a performance, choreographed to crush spirits. The judge, his face contorted with fury, bellowed over every word, pounding the courtroom with his voice like a hammer striking an anvil. No defense was tolerated, no interruptions allowed. Every movement, every insult, was a weapon meant to intimidate, to break the will of those who dared to stand against the Reich. And yet, the students did not break. Even as insults rained down, they sat upright, calm, unshaken. They would not renounce what they believed, not even to save their lives. In that room where the very idea of justice had been murdered, one man stood out not for fairness, but for his fanatic cruelty and blind devotion to the most brutal regime the modern world had ever known. His name was Roland Freisler, Hitler's screaming judge, a man who could have used his brilliant legal mind to defend truth, but instead wielded it to serve terror. From a prisoner of war in Russia to the ruthless president of Nazi Germany's most feared court, Freisler embodied the nightmare that unfolds when law is bent to the service of hatred. Early life and rise. Roland Freisler was born on the 30th of October, 1893, in the small city of Celle, then part of the German Empire. His father, Julius Freisler, was an engineer and civil servant, a man of precision and order. His mother, Charlotte, came from more modest roots, but she poured her energy into nurturing her son's mind. Young Roland quickly revealed himself to be a gifted student, sharp with words and endlessly confident in debate. These talents, which might have marked him for greatness, would one day be twisted toward darker ends. In 1914, as Europe plunged into the chaos of World War I, Freisler was studying law at the University of Kiel. His education was abruptly interrupted when he enlisted in the Imperial German Army as an officer cadet. On the front lines with the 22nd Division, he fought with enough ferocity to earn the Iron Cross, second class, for heroism in combat. But in October 1915, fate turned. Wounded on the Eastern Front, Freisler fell into the hands of Imperial Russian forces. Life in a prisoner of war camp could have broken him, yet it became an unexpected crucible. He learned Russian fluently and even developed an interest in Marxist theory, a detail that would later fuel rumors and suspicion about his political loyalties. After the Russian Revolution erupted, the new Bolshevik authorities appointed him commissar of the camp, overseeing food distribution from 1917 to 1918. By the late 1932, whispers of this red past would shadow him, even as he insisted he had never collaborated with the Soviet regime, an ideological enemy of the Nazis. Still, the stain of suspicion never entirely faded. When he returned to Germany in 1918, Freisler resumed his law studies, earning his doctorate from the University of Jena in 1922. But the Germany he came home to was a nation in turmoil, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, crushed by reparations, and torn apart by hyperinflation. It was a breeding ground for extremism. At first, Freisler was not directly tied to any political movement. He built a reputation as a sharp, combative lawyer, especially in politically charged cases. But by the late 1922, his views had veered sharply to the right. On the 9th of July, 1925, he joined the Nazi Party, becoming member number 9679, a relatively early recruit. His oratorical skill and deep knowledge of the law caught the attention of party leaders, and before long he was a city councillor in Kassel, preaching the Nazi gospel with unflinching zeal. In his speeches, he thundered against Jews, socialists, and anyone he saw as an enemy of the state. He railed for a vision of Germany where the so-called collective will stood above individual rights. In 1928, he married Marion Russeger, with whom he would have 2 sons. But it was the rise of Adolf Hitler in January 1933 that transformed Freisler's career from promising to perilous. The Nazis needed legal minds who could cloak dictatorship in the robes of legitimacy, and Freisler was more than willing. Appointed ministerial director in the Prussian Ministry of Justice, he wasted no time purging Jewish officials from the department. His mastery of legal texts, quick wit, and explosive courtroom presence made him not just an enforcer of Nazi law, but its embodiment. And yet, for all his loyalty, Hitler never appointed him to a post outside the legal system, perhaps because Freisler had few allies among the Nazi elite, or perhaps because of the lingering taint of his time in Russia. His own brother, Oswald Freisler, had even defended anti-Nazi clients in court, wearing his party badge in defiance, earning a personal rebuke from Joseph Goebbels and expulsion from the party by Hitler himself. Still, within the courts, Roland Freisler was unstoppable, ready to reshape the law itself into an instrument of racial hatred and absolute power. The Nazi legal architect. By the early 1932, Germany's democracy was already crumbling, but Freisler would help deliver the final blow. Behind closed doors, he became one of the key legal minds transforming the country's judicial system into a weapon of totalitarian control. He threw his weight behind legislation that stripped away civil liberties, replacing the principle of equality before the law with a hierarchy built on Nazi racial ideology. Laws permitting indefinite detention without trial, special courts for political crimes, and the dismantling of due process all bore the stamp of this new legal order, an order Freisler championed. He even published chillingly titled works, such as The Biological Racial Task Involved in the Reform of Juvenile Criminal Law. In it, he argued that so-called racially alien or degenerate youths, those deemed incurable or defective, should be locked away in correctional facilities, segregated from racially valuable German children. Freisler also became one of the loudest voices pushing for laws against racial defilement, the Nazi term for sexual relations between Aryans and people of inferior races. As early as 1933, he called for a total ban on such relationships. 2 years later, in September 1935, these ideas became enshrined in the infamous Nuremberg laws. The Reich citizenship law declared that only those of German or related blood could be full citizens, stripping Jews of political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor outlawed marriages and intimate relations between Jews and Germans, claiming such unions would pollute the Aryan race. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Freisler's role grew even more sinister. Just a month later, he introduced the concept of the early juvenile criminal, giving courts for the first time in German legal history the power to sentence minors to death. At least 72 young Germans would be executed under this decree, but his most feared chapter was yet to come. In August 1942, Freisler was appointed president of the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, established by Hitler to handle cases of treason and political dissent. On paper, it was part of the judicial system. In reality, it was a political guillotine. Verdicts were dictated not by law but by the regime's demand for terror and control. Under Freisler's reign, the People's Court's execution rate skyrocketed. He boasted of delivering guilty verdicts in nearly 90% of cases. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 5,000 people were sentenced to death by his gavel. One of his first high-profile cases as president was against the White Rose Resistance. Arrested in February 1943, the group's central members, including siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, were hauled before Freisler. In a courtroom packed with spectators, he hurled insults, spat accusations of treason, and cut off their every attempt to speak. Yet Hans and Sophie remained composed. Sophie, with quiet defiance, told him, "After all, someone had to start. What we wrote and said is believed by many others, they just don't have the courage to say it as we did." She even confronted him directly. "You know the war is lost. Why don't you have the courage to face it?" The verdict, of course, was predetermined. All were condemned to die originally by hanging, but the method was changed to the guillotine to avoid turning them into public martyrs. For Freisler, the trial was not about law. It was theater, red-robed, fist-slamming theater, meant to humiliate the accused and glorify Nazi power. And in the years ahead, this theater would only grow darker. Humiliation as a weapon. If justice is meant to be blind, under Roland Freisler it was not only sighted, it was armed, cruel, and merciless. Freisler's courtroom was a stage, and humiliation was his chosen performance art. He shouted so ferociously that sound technicians had to turn down microphone sensitivity to avoid distortion. His interruptions were constant. His insults were rehearsed to sting. He called defendants worms, parasites, traitors to the fatherland, and seemed to relish watching them squirm. But he didn't stop at words. The degradation was physical. Defendants were often given old, oversized clothes without belts, forcing them to clutch their trousers just to stand before him. Freisler knew what that looked like on camera. It made the accused appear ridiculous, weak, unworthy of sympathy. For him, the People's Court was never a neutral institution. It was explicitly political. He admitted openly that he wanted to judge as Hitler himself would judge. The proceedings were stripped of logic and law, twisted into a grotesque dance of rage and ritualized condemnation. This same unshakable loyalty to Nazi ideology carried Freisler into one of the darkest meetings of the war. On the 20th of January, 1942, in a mansion in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials gathered to formalize the final solution to the so-called Jewish question. Freisler's role was to provide legal counsel for a plan that aimed to annihilate 11 million Jews across Europe, including those in neutral countries. No objection passed his lips. Just a year later, his paths crossed once more with the White Rose. On the 19th of April, 1943, he presided over a second trial of group members. Before the session even began, he barked, "National Socialism does not need a penal code for traitors like you. I will make this process short." Then, in a display of raw contempt, he hurled the actual penal code at the defendant's bench, forcing one to duck. The results were predictable: 3 more death sentences, 9 prison terms, and 1 acquittal that surprised even the courtroom spectators. His cruelty extended beyond political activists. Alfreda Scholl, sister of the famed German author Erich Maria Remarque, found herself in Freisler's crosshairs after a landlord overheard her say the Nazis were losing the war. Her brother's works had already been banned and burned as unpatriotic, but Alfreda stayed in Germany. At trial, Freisler snarled, "Your brother is beyond our reach, but you will not escape us." She was guillotined on the 16th of December, 1943, and yet the blood on his hands would deepen further when an audacious act of military rebellion shook the Nazi regime in 1944. The 20th of July plot and Freisler's peak of cruelty. By the summer of 1944, the Nazi Empire was cracking. The Allies were advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east, and Germany's military fortunes had shifted from triumphant conquest to desperate defense. For a growing number of German officers, Hitler was no longer just a failing leader. He was the architect of the Reich's impending ruin. On the 20th of July, 1944, that simmering discontent erupted. High-ranking officers, including Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb exploded but failed to kill its target. Within hours, the regime struck back. Arrests spread like wildfire through the ranks of the military and the resistance. The conspirators who survived the initial purge were funneled straight to Freisler's People's Court. Here, his cruelty reached its most grotesque display. Trials were filmed, not for the sake of justice, but for propaganda designed to show the German public the merciless justice of the state. Freisler began each proceeding in an almost calm, methodical tone, questioning the accused like any other judge might. But then without warning he would erupt, his voice booming, his words slashing like knives. He mocked aristocratic titles, accused decorated war heroes of stabbing German soldiers in the back, and twisted their motives into cowardice. The humiliation was as deliberate as the verdicts. Defendants were forced to wear ill-fitting clothes, some without belts or ties. In one trial, Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben was forced to keep one hand gripping his trousers to prevent them from falling, prompting Freisler to sneer, "You dirty old man, why do you keep playing with your trousers?" But even in the face of such degradation, some fought back with words. Witzleben's final statement was defiant. "You may hand us over to the executioner. In 3 months, the outraged and tormented people will call you to account and drag you alive through the streets." Others delivered chilling prophecies. Caesar von Hofacker, a resistance leader, told Freisler, "Be quiet now, Herr Freisler, because today it is my head, but within a year it will be yours." General Erich Felgebel, condemned to die, retorted, "Then hurry up, Mr. President. or you'll be hanging before we are." Ulrich Wilhelm, Count of Schwerin von Schwanenfeld, weakened from imprisonment, tried to explain that his opposition to Hitler stemmed from the countless murders committed in Germany and abroad. Freisler cut him off, shouting, "You are truly garbage." The scale of the purge was staggering. Over 7,000 were arrested in connection to the plot. Nearly 5,000 were executed, some within just 2 hours of their sentencing. Evidence was often non-existent. Guilt was assumed. The People's Court had always been a theater of political murder, but now it was a full-blown, grotesque spectacle. Through it all, Freisler's devotion to Hitler never wavered. He relished his role as executioner in judicial robes, certain that his service to the Führer would carry him through to the Reich's final victory. But fate had already set the date for his downfall. Death of the Screaming Judge. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own crimes and the relentless advance of Allied forces. Berlin itself was under siege from the skies, bombs rained down almost daily, and the Nazi capital shook under the force of destruction. On the 3rd of February, 1945, Roland Freisler was in his element, presiding over yet another political trial inside the People's Court building. Outside, the air raid sirens wailed another bombing run. This one, however, would be different. As the Allied bombers roared overhead, their payloads found the court's coordinates. Explosions tore through the building. Masonry cracked and steel twisted in the air. Then, in a moment that seemed almost cinematic in its irony, a massive stone column collapsed onto the president of the People's Court. Freisler was crushed instantly. Some witnesses later claimed that when rescuers found his body, he was still clutching the file of the defendant, whose fate he had been preparing to seal. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths with cold certainty would not live to witness the final collapse of Hitler's empire. 3 months later, in May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Allied forces moved swiftly to dismantle the Nazi legal apparatus. The People's Court was formally abolished, and all its verdicts were declared null and void. Many Nazi judges were dead or captured, but justice was far from complete. Most of those who had enforced Hitler's laws quietly returned to legal practice in the new Germany. As for Roland Freisler, he was buried in his wife's family grave in Berlin. His name does not appear on the tombstone, as if even in death he was to be erased from memory. More than 25 years later, Luisa von Bender, wife of General Alfred Jodl, recalled working at the Lützow hospital when Freisler's body was brought in. Upon seeing the infamous judge's corpse, a hospital worker remarked simply, "It is God's verdict." No one answered. Closing reflection. Roland Freisler's life is a chilling reminder of how the law, when placed in the hands of zealots, can become one of the most devastating weapons in a dictator's arsenal. He was not just a judge, he was an actor in a macabre theater, where verdicts were scripted and justice was strangled before it could breathe. From his early brilliance as a student of language and law to his decorated service in the First World War, Freisler could have chosen a path of integrity and fairness. Instead, he shaped his talents into tools of intimidation, degradation, and death. He twisted legal codes to fit racial ideology, silenced dissent with red-robed fury, and presided over trials where the accused were already condemned the moment they entered the room. He mocked the brave, shamed the innocent, and boasted of his efficiency in delivering death sentences. Yet, in the end, he met his own fate, not at the hands of the people he had wronged, but beneath the falling ruins of a dying regime. His sudden death spared him the reckoning that so many hoped to see: a public trial where he would be forced to stand in the place of those he had tormented. Today, Freisler's name is etched into history not for the laws he passed, but for the lives he destroyed. His story stands as a warning. The erosion of justice does not happen overnight. It begins with small compromises, laws bent to serve ideology, and judges who believe themselves above the principles they swore to uphold. When justice becomes a tool of oppression, the court becomes a battlefield, and men like Roland Freisler, draped in authority, become its most dangerous soldiers. And in that final moment, when a single collapsing column ended the reign of Hitler's screaming judge, perhaps there was a strange, silent symmetry. The weight of destruction he had helped unleash returned, quite literally, to crush him.